Hi, this is Todd Lee M.D, IFBB 2012 North American Lightweight Bodybuilding Champion and Medical Doctor with MindandMuscle.com. Today I'm going to explain the rationale and science behind the diet that's presented in 30-Day Transformation, The Time Is Now, the core article for all the other articles regarding diet and training. So, John Kiefer, who writes for Flex Magazine, has been working on a concept for the past 20 years called Carb-Backloading. I want to point this out right off the bat. This is not my idea. This is not an original idea at all. It's just the science is sound, and a lot of people saw great results, so I started trying it with some help, and it works out fantastic. Basically, here's the premise. Modern belief was that carbohydrates are the primary fuel source, and you should take all your carbs in during the day and none at night, because if you consume carbs during the day, you burn carbs during the day and you have energy during the day. And at night, you don't have any carbs, and that gets your insulin low so that when you go to sleep, you're burning fat. You wake up in the morning, your cortisol, glucagon are high, and growth hormone secretion's high due to the fasting state, and you're more likely to burn fat that way. Then you consume carbohydrates, and this is where the problem lies. If you consume the carbohydrates when your cortisol is high, they're more likely to be stored as both fat and muscle glycogen. So it doesn't really make sense. Why would you want to spike your insulin in that state? And insulin plus cortisol isn't going to be fat burning, it's going to be more fat deposition. So we've already screwed up with breakfast. Now, if you were to continue having carbs throughout the day, your insulin level, in theory, if you're using the right fats like monounsaturated, if you're using complex carbs like beans, sweet potato, wild rice, whatever, that's going to keep your blood sugar normal and your insulin level normal throughout the day. And you can run on that for fuel, but you're not going to burn any fat because your insulin's still somewhat elevated. In theory, you might build some muscle during that time period. Then you go and hit the gym. Because you're in a carb state, you're not going to get much growth hormone release. So you're not going to burn much fat while you're training. You're not going to have much growth hormone after you train. Carbs have also been proven to decrease the amount of testosterone that's secreted from training. Now, you're not really primed to absorb nutrients and be super insulin sensitive because you've been in an insulin state all day. So even though you do get some GLUT4 transporter upregulation in the muscle tissue, even though the muscle tissue is more insulin sensitive than before you lifted, it's not as sensitive as it could be. So then you consume a huge influx of carbohydrates, as you're supposed to. The studies show that you can benefit from as little as 30 grams of straight dextrose post-training. And that spikes your insulin more, which makes your insulin supposedly bind more to the muscle, which makes more nutrients go to the muscle. Then about 3 or 4 hours after you're done training, you're going to now have an insulin crash, because in theory that used to be the last time you'd have carbs for the day. So right around nighttime, when studies have actually shown the muscles are the most insulin sensitive, is when people are craving carbs. That's why the whole habit about having a lot of bread at dinner and then having ice cream before you go to bed started, was people are more carb sensitive and crave carbs more at night. So in theory, this is when you've got to deprive yourself. And after years of doing diets like this, I've noticed this myself, that you basically are miserable before you go to bed, and you can't sleep because you had your insulin up relatively high all day, and then it crashed right before you go to bed, so you have all your cravings at night. Then if you're someone who's taking something like GHRP6 or using the Generate spray that binds to the ghrelin receptor, now you've got an artificial increase in your appetite before bed. So you're just ravenous. Now, yeah, you're primed perfect for burning fat before you go to sleep. But then after 4 or 5 hours from your last carb meal, your glucagon goes up, and that starts breaking down tissue to make more carbohydrates. So you get something called a Smomogi effect. I might be pronouncing that wrong, where your blood sugar might be higher when you rise in the morning than when you went to bed at night, because you had to start tapping into your fuel sources to get your glucose levels back up. So what Kiefer came up with was an entirely different approach. Now, he seems to sync it really well with a paleo nutrition plan. So you're using a lot of whole foods, and it's almost like a paleo diet. The exception is to the fact that it's a paleo diet is that you start your carbs for the day after your workout. And you can consume the carbs in the evening because you're more insulin sensitive at that state. So an ideal approach would be this. You wake up in the morning, your cortisol's high, your growth hormone's high, and your testosterone is getting ready to be synthesized. You have a relatively high-fat, high-cholesterol meal with eggs and bacon and whatnot, and that doesn't shut off your growth hormone. It doesn't spike your insulin. It doesn't shut off your cortisol. So the growth hormone plus cortisol effect is going to be massive fat burning. You start adding in saturated fats, you get an uncoupling effect on the mitochondria for additional use of fat to maintain energy states. Because you're consuming cholesterol, you now have the material necessary to make testosterone for the day. So you start getting that benefit and you run on fat for fuels. This is when coconut oil or MCT oil is a good idea because it's a rapidly absorbing, rapidly usable fat source that kicks in right away, almost like sugar. It's like the fat equivalent of sugar, but there's no negative hormone in fat application. In fact, it's got a positive benefit. It's more likely to convert over to ketone bodies. So whereas normally your brain has to run on carbohydrates throughout the day, 135 grams per day minimum, now it can run on ketones because you've been in a fasting state and you start upregulating that medium chain triglyceride absorption. So you start getting these ketone bodies, you run on that into your second meal, which is going to be protein and fat. Again, your body runs on fat. You could use healthier fat sources with lower saturated fat levels, like avocado is very popular, although I think it's overused. Peanuts and almonds are often overused. Olive oil is a relatively safer bet because it doesn't taste good, so people won't overuse it. Eventually you get towards your workout. That's when you can have a pre-workout drink. Now the Wicked 2.1 has been specifically designed to work well with carb backloading so that it amplifies all of the proper hormones you want while you're training. So since you begin training in a carb-free state, growth hormone gets skyrocketed. If you take something like Wicked 2.1, you're going to get an upregulation of growth hormone release, an upregulation of adrenal hormones release, so that you start burning way more fat while you're training. Because the training is so intense, because of the Wicked 2.1, you will then be ready to work harder, and that causes more release of growth hormone and more release of testosterone, the testosterone you made earlier in the day from this diet. So when you're done with your workout, your growth hormone and your testosterone are relatively high. Cortisol may be high, but it won't be that high if your workout is 45 minutes. After about 45 minutes is when cortisol starts being released in weight training. It's not the end of the world if your workout goes over 45 minutes, but we want to talk about ideals. So this is when you wait about 30 minutes for the growth hormone to continue to be released. After about 30 minutes, there's no more growth hormone that's going to be produced from that workout. That's when you consume your carbohydrates. So hopefully you've had some amino acids before this point, but if you have them now, that's okay. So the amino acids plus the simple carbohydrates like dextrose, post-workout 30 minutes in a completely carb-free state, will skyrocket your insulin because the carbohydrates and the amino acids work together to get a synergistic insulin release effect. Because the muscles have not had any insulin all day, and your body is primed to make all of your nutrients and insulin bind to the muscles, it just fills the muscles with everything you take in. And you get this major hormone cascade that results in muscle building because you get the growth hormone up, you get the testosterone up, insulin then goes just where you want it to, which then drives everything you're taking, like creatine, into the muscles. The muscle synthesis is sparked into ignition, and you start building muscle at that point. Now, depending on how many carbs you get per day, you would then have more carbs at your next meal and subsequent meals until it's close to bedtime. Depending on if you're just focused on building muscle or if you're interested in building muscle and burning fat at the same time, is when you would shut the carbs off. Ideally, if you want to start burning fat while you're sleeping, you want to shut your carbs off a couple hours before bedtime. And if you really want to amplify the fat burning response while you're sleeping, that's when you do something like Generate by LT Sciences, or CJC 1295 or GHRP6. And that would increase the growth hormone release while you're sleeping, which protects the muscles and then facilitates the cortisol's burning of the fat. The next day, the cycle starts anew. So in summation, with carb backloading, you just have carbs after you train, 30 minutes after you train, up until about 2 hours before you go to bed. It's the only time you eat carbs all day. In theory, you could eat almost all carbs during that time period. You just have to be careful that you don't spark too much of a natural insulin release, because that's going to take 8 hours to bleed out. But we don't want it overflowing too much. So using complex carbohydrates may be useful for additional meals. The first one would be simple carbs like dextrose or white rice, and then every meal after that can be complex carbs like sweet potato, wild rice. Anyway, that's carb backloading in a nutshell. John Kiefer's brainchild. This is Todd Lee M.D. with MindandMuscle.com.